Hello, and welcome to the Secret Tree of Alchemy, the Cancer Trumps, Part 4. Hopefully, I'll be able to make this kind of a lead-in into discussing the Capricorn trump card, the Devil. That's the trump card that I wanted to discuss originally, but my mind is still rolling on this Cancer trump cards situation. The information, as usual, will be golden, okay? So, an important consideration when discussing the astrological sign of Cancer, as mentioned in a previous episode, is that of an intelligence vehicle, right? Another way of looking at an intelligence vehicle is as an antenna, okay? You can think of your body as an intelligence vehicle, for example. And you can approach that issue from the perspective of observing the functions associated with a big antenna, okay, that transmits and receives, right? So, in association with that, you would be describing processes that imply, eventually, methodologies, right? Which is why you get, in association with these trump cards, the ideas associated with practicing meditations, right? And it just so happens that in our time, a field of psychology is opening up that when I was going to school about 5 years ago, they had classes available to the effect of practicing compassion, right? And this involved various meditative practices, that you practiced in the classroom and also as homework. And you wrote reports on your experiences associated with that. And you kind of paid more, as one of the meditations, you paid more attention to what was going on around you in everyday life. In regard, developing everything associated with fostering in your life compassion, right? It's kind of a Buddhist-oriented class. I was kind of, mildly scoffing my way into taking this class. Once I realized what it was, right, I thought it was going to be like another psychology class where we get into the theory and long-developed psychology of compassion, studying brain scans and what have you. And there's some of that in this course, but it was mostly just, practices involving meditation, which just so happens to be what these Cancer trumps are all about. In order to practice or foster or embody compassion in your life, you have to have empathy rolling in your life somehow or another, right? And basically, what this involves is being, at some point in your life, an empath. So these trump cards relate ideas associated with being, constitutionally speaking, an empath. All right? The very constitution of your body and soul as what might be described as an intelligence vehicle. Another way of putting it is that you are a communications vehicle, in the sense that you are communicating with the universes themselves, right? And they communicate back with you, and you communicate with the environment around you, and it communicates with you through the very constitution of your being. Okay, your body, and what is termed quite often soul, which can be approached conceptually as a collectivity, right, of experience and ideas and what you might call spirits. You as a being can be thought of as a constitution, right, a constituency, a collectivity, right? full of ideas, thought streams, and what have you going on. There's a certain amount of momentum associated with this. But this collectivity communicates, okay? So it communicates with the universe around you and on an etheric level, right? Your ether body communicates with the cosmic ether. And you experience this, tend to experience it anyway in the form of various emotions and related intuitions, right? That, can develop towards some rather advanced expressions of empathy to where others might label you an empath, right? And this is basically common. Although the media would have you think, this is so special, right? But special, really, once you study alchemy, you realize it's a matter of talent, right? What is automatic with you. And also at the same time of value, all right? Not everything automatic is of value, though you could always argue even valueless automaticities are survival tools, right? Survival adaptations. Even defense mechanisms that take on inhibitory properties as they become automatic. After you get through the inefficiencies associated with habituation, whether it be a belief that's not true or an unsound belief that causes, ultimately for you maybe from time to time cognitive dissonance, because something's wrong and you can't put a finger on it necessarily. That's kind of an empathic response in its own right. But getting back to empathy, right, and being an empath, this apparently is something you can develop. And some of the methods that are used are what you would call meditations. And meditation can be focused outwardly, as in, object relations of one kind or another with the world around you. Or it can be focused inwardly. And still you're basically dealing with what amounts to object relations on that level. So these two trump cards kind of flip back and forth between those two perspectives. One supports the other. So with fortune, you are basically paying attention on an outer level. For example, you could say that the Sphinx in fortune is reading books or having conversations with other individuals, and in the process is developing faculties along those lines, right? One faculty seems to be gripped by the world and is held back, but is on the verge of, turning a corner, so to speak, right? Reincarnating, so to speak. Another faculty that's developing looks a bit more simian, but is still armored, is the monkey thing that seems to have released itself from being so bound up by the world and actually has some grasp of reality developing, right? To the point where it's effectively climbing a ladder in the form of that wheel, right? The wheel of, I think Crowley calls it Torah, the wheel of the world, the way of the world, the wheel of fortune, okay? Fortune has a lot to do with paying attention. So when one becomes hapless, for example, one becomes unfortunate, though this is something that really tends to happen in time as one is not paying attention enough, right? So the word hapless can get bound up in the ideation associated with becoming unfortunate or also becoming unaware. Okay, your communications are less efficient. You're not paying attention. Therefore, the world cannot efficiently communicate with you. Over time, that means effectively, you cannot efficiently communicate with the world. Okay. Fortune is reduced for you effectively over time. This has a lot to do with the development of what many call ignorance, but such ignorance also tends to be intimately bound up with what others term neurosis, for which there is associated both anesthesia and amnesia. Okay. A lack of ability to sense, okay, and communicate outwardly with the world. This is, caught up in the experience of neurosis as the body is armored in life, as portrayed in the fortune trump. The gator thing, that suggests armoring of a kind, callousing, all right? And so does the monkey figure that seems to have a shell on its back like a turtle. But it's moving around, it's moving along on its own terms, climbing that ladder, right? Its armoring is taking on appearances that are actively maintained on the part of the individual. Hopefully not to an ego-inflated degree, but shall we say egocentric degree. But in terms of, interfacing effectively. Naturally masking to a degree, but putting your best foot forward to be more effective in communicating, right? Which is natural for people. A certain degree of masking in life is natural, right? You develop over time an effective persona that greases the wheels of social interaction with the world. And then eventually this becomes the Sphinx figure up top, where the armoring is carried forward in a particularly dressed fashion and in a masking fashion that doesn't fully mask the figure, which has clearly a human face, right? It has control over its armoring in life. To the degree you could argue it's no longer neurotic, but neurosis is difficult to get rid of, even over the course of one lifetime, right? But, in the practices introduced through this course, this compassion training course, right? You're learning, relaxation exercises to be practiced on a daily basis, and also meditations that have much to do with paying attention to what's going on around you. And also paying attention to yourself, and also imagining things on your own terms. Learning how to bring about experiences of positive psychological scope, okay, that you would find practiced in the field of positive psychology, for example. Imagining yourself in a safe place or a wonderful place, a natural place full of fresh air and green trees and blue water and sunshine, and just a safe place to be in your mind. Okay. Safe place is a Cancer analogy, especially, in Fortune and in the Chariot, two different perspectives on the same idea, safe place, home, trust, relaxation, parasympathetic nervous response predominating instead of the sympathetic nervous response. So you can spend time reflecting and musing and communicating with self and others, right? In a relaxed environment. You have guests over, you can communicate with them, have meaningful conversations and what have you, and get to know people. You're developing empathy through all of these practices, and you can, over time, take these practices out into the world around you, where empathy is more difficult to practice because people have a tendency to armor up to a degree and callous themselves to the outer world. This is appropriate to a degree, natural, but this can also become unnatural to the degree that you live in a hostile environment. For example, an organized, criminally dominated neighborhood or environment, right? So one becomes calloused, one becomes conditioned to looking the other way, not being a witness to what's going on, right? You're becoming ignorant under those conditions, and in your own right, you're becoming organized, criminally inclined over time, which is part of the design of things, right? In an organized criminal world, everyone is required to be an organized criminal to an appropriate degree in support of that system, right? If you deviate from that, you might find yourself murdered as a witness of some kind or another, even in analogous terms that you don't fully understand. Once the hammer's coming down on you, right? And it might be a badge-wearing officer that brings that hammer down. The world has become so corrupt, right? An officer that was selected for duty because he or she has certain traits of relative ignorance and organized criminal inclination. All right, they can't seem to do anything but practice tyranny while on the job or in their lives. So the system undermines, well, a tyranny system undermines empathy and reduces people to something less than an empath. So you become less empathetic, more calloused. These are all traits that I'm going to be discussing when I'm discussing Capricorn and the devil, right? Anyway, when organized crime strikes, it gets into your domicile eventually, even on a covert level. Okay, for example, you're being invaded via, organized criminal invitation, people being flown into your country from a foreign continent even. They get into your neighborhood. They get into the building where you live. They eventually are sneaking in and out of your apartment when you're out. And they know when you're out far enough away for them to be able to get away with doing it because they network. They're an intelligence network. They will steal your identity by going through all your files, for example. Okay? And that identity becomes part of a network, a criminal network soul, if you will, or collectivity. Okay, your very soul is stolen from you. It mirrors out-of-body vampirism practices taking place in conjunction with this criminal organizational invasion taking place. And these people are very proud to do it. And the people they go after are the freedom people, the empathetic people. Empathy has to be browbeaten down for organized crime to take over. Okay, you have to become insensitive rather than sensitive. Even militantly so, just so they can draw you into controlled oppositional conflict on their terms, not on your terms. And their terms are, of course, covert. Okay, they're an intelligence network. All right? They have become intelligence vehicles for covert intelligence, secret intelligence. So that is empathy. Okay, empathy is a prerequisite for compassion. Okay, compassion depends upon empathy. Okay, compassion involves experiencing somebody else's negative emotions, basically, that they're experiencing, and suffering the same way they suffer, right? But the flip side of that coin is the mind has a natural tendency to want to solve problems. So if you're compassionate, you get caught up in solving other people's problems on top of your own. And that can overwhelm you too, because that is also an attack route designed to, well, it's a way of browbeating you down by, testing you with what amounts to highway robbery. The network can put things in front of you to test you on this level. They want you to give all your money over or whatever. You don't have any to give, really, or you need your money just to stay alive. And they know this, and they know that you're going to learn to callous yourself on that level too. And the networks will do this. Okay, the intelligence network. Nothing is random once you're a target. Okay. First day of school, for example, if you're going to go get a psychology degree, the faculty know about you ahead of time going to school, so they test you. They have somebody, fake, laying on the ground on the pathway going to school. And for some reason, if you have any empathetic tendencies at all, you clue into the fact and you just kind of walk through the situation. And sure enough, it turns out to be fake as you walk back and find that nobody's laying there. You tested the situation that they put in front of you to test you, and it turns out to be fake. So beyond any shadow of a doubt, you're being tracked by an intelligence network into school, just like you've been tracked all your life, right? Going to work, moving from place to place during childhood, quote-unquote friends waiting there for you to arrive that, start to undermine you systematically in life. You have to learn the hard lessons associated with not being susceptible to such things, and there's a certain amount of callousing associated with that because the horror of it apparently is too much for you. It might get you killed even. So in early adulthood, you have to systematically escape that ignorance that developed in your life to where you realize certain friends were not real friends after the fact, after you're safe to do so, right? So your empathetic system of, soul, you might call it, is intelligent, very intelligent. It might protect you simply by not communicating certain ideas to you until it's safe to do so, right? The idea is to keep you alive as well as developing, right? So during childhood, if you're a hostage child, for example, controlled by MK Ultra, that goes on for life. And as a child, you're effectively a hostage. Your own parents are proxies, like Antifa proxies, for these people who have BLM people in the background, right? Observing the situation and controlling the situation from that perspective. Like the house help up at 10050 Cielo Drive was for JSK's situation. Kind of a representative, you might say, of the Black Panthers in the situation. So, yeah, developing empathy in life is a severe challenge when you've got organized criminal intelligence operating around you. It wants to callous you. At first you'll be calloused, but eventually you'll be inhibited on an automatic level, out of automaticity, which is way worse than all the stress you went through to habituate such a condition for yourself that involved muscular armoring and related somewhat traumatic callousing, right? That was with you all through childhood. You wondering what was wrong with you the whole time, right? Why your muscles and your body seem to be, contorted just a bit. And it seems like other people are contorted maybe too straight. And they have certain characteristics that they take on. You'll eventually realize something maybe along the lines of it being compulsive in nature. The whole thing, really. But some people seem to draw benefits from it, whereas other people seem not to. And, I could get into the detailed discussion of that whole thing, but you could read about it in something like Wilhelm Reich's Character Analysis, or Mass Psychology of Fascism, or James DeMio's Saharasia. okay, which discusses, things like skull binding as a means of imposing technologically severe neurosis on people, right? That is exploited militarily, you might say. It's old school military technology, right? So they would develop an entire characterological development technology based upon lessons they've learned as nomads, swaddling their infants around on boards with their skulls bound to the board to protect them from dying from the traveling traumas, during infancy, right? Very young infants are very delicate creatures, right? So these strange tendencies, these cultic tendencies, tend to evolve, okay, over time, literally as an expression of human evolution, where people die over the issue and then maybe others don't die, but they reproduce. But in reproducing, they also pass down cultural technologies of cultic scope, right? Compulsory destructive cultic scope that impact people characterologically. That includes callousing them through muscular armoring chronically maintained, produces an anesthetic, an anesthetized condition on people chronically, reducing pain, right? And also a related amnesic quality, where you forget certain traumas associated, especially with your infant years, right? This can all be studied, studying somebody like Wilhelm Reich, and also getting into studying Freud. Wilhelm Reich happens to be a particularly good channel through which to begin studying Freud. But Freud is very much worth reading anyway, as core information related to all these issues. Reading Freud reduces your tendency to be confused by anything Wilhelm Reich is expressing, for example, or Carl Jung for that matter. I learned some things through reading Jung that are actually Freudian, that I initially ascribed to Jung, but it's actually Freud. So, and there's plenty of others to study. Kohut, for example, Adler, Ferenczi probably too. I think he wrote books. He was a particularly good Freudian therapist who was a member of the central Freudian cult, right? He remained a Freudian rather than being excommunicated. But he was supposedly particularly talented as a therapist. But an important function of psychoanalysis is allowing, making it so you can learn again how to become sensitive to situation and self, to the point where you're sensitive to your own behaviors, right? Your own thinking and your own emoting, right? And you start to make sense of it for yourself. You start to understand it. You gain insight to where you can begin to modify the situation over time. You can begin to predict things and then modify things, right? It's a scientific process overall, even though the therapeutic situation is a very difficult scientific situation as far as experimentation is concerned. But overall, it's still, the human mind works in scientific ways and philosophical ways, and so does Freudianism and psychoanalysis as a result. The clinical situation is its own test tube or petri dish, you might say. It's just that you can't bring in a third party to isolate the situation as a control or an experiment, right? So you can't use Karl Popper's methods either in that situation to systematically prove or disprove, right? So, but in making yourself more aware and sensitive through psychoanalysis and also self-analysis, which is a normal human process in life. You are basically making yourself into more of an empath over time. Therefore, you are building up your soul. As you know, you're building up experiences. Psychoanalysis should make that process more efficient for you if it's honest psychoanalysis being conducted rather than intelligence networked vampirism. Now, when we get into discussing Capricorn, we'll be discussing the very opposite of empathy, okay? We'll be getting into the dark pentad, I like to call it. Some people prefer dark triad because that is much tested psychological construct, right? Or even dark tetrad because there's scientific reaching into that particular consideration on an effective level, you know, in the sense of collecting data and analyzing data, at least, you know, with statistical analyses based upon self-report questionnaires and what have you, and standardized instruments, you know, developed along those lines. So, but then there's the issue of masochism that goes along with sadism, right? One doesn't really exist without the other. So in the end, in my view, it's a dark pentad. But up here in Cancer land, things are kind of the very opposite of that. And this is where you start to reveal to yourself a lot of the fakery associated with published astrology, where there has to be a personality that develops under the astrological signs. And, you know, if you're a Capricorn, you got these traits, and if you're a Cancer, you got these other traits, and that really doesn't hold up over, you know, under serious scrutiny over a considerable enough amount of time, right? So, for example, with psychoanalysis, your emotions become something you spend time analyzing, right? And the psychoanalyst is supposed to help you with this process, you know, through free association, ideas will come across your mind, emotions will flash across your mind in association with specific situational cues brought up in your mind. You can think of the clinical situation as kind of a tapestry or a backdrop where these practices are practiced in a safe space for both the therapist and the patient, right? It's kept conversational. You're communicating back and forth, and in so doing, you're becoming empathetic with each other, right? You're beginning to experience each other's emotions to a degree, right? A practice therapist will be appropriately adjusted to this environment. Never more calloused than necessary, but certainly resilient in the face of it, right? Through long practice, right, over time. But the patient isn't necessarily so resilient, right? So there's always a little bit of danger that a patient might break with the trust established through the clinical setting, right? Which is conversational, it's face-to-face conversation, or it's the Freudian traditional situation with Freud kind of sitting out of your view while you're on the couch, and he's kind of in the background of your mind effectively that way. Kind of acting as sort of like a voice coming from your preconscious mind a little bit, filtering things a little bit, just enough to influence things and promote the process of free association that you're supposed to be engaged in the clinical setting, right? And though this is an adjunct to the natural therapy that takes place in life, it still takes a long time, typically, compared with other therapeutic modalities of genuinely useful effect, right? You're communicating with self and another at the same time. That's empathy practice taking place right there. It's a meditation of a sort. You're meditating when you're practicing free association. And you're engaged in this process with a coach helping you along, right? Offering up just the right interpretation at just the right time to bring about some manner of process in regard to you, increasing your ability to communicate with self and others. Okay, becoming aware on a sound level, a truthful level. Okay, in a manner that, any underlying cognitive dissonance, for example, reveals itself. The discomfort of mind, right, comes to the surface, because these things tend to layer themselves chronologically as you try to remember back through time. Where, if you're lying to yourself somehow, there's a cognitive dissonance associated with that. And cognitive dissonance is only, I only understand so much about it. It's just something that came up probably just now because I'm trying to learn about it still. But people become uncomfortable when facing a situation of conflict, potential conflict, implied conflict. Ambivalence would have a certain amount of cognitive dissonance wrapped up in it. A lack of soundness of mind, of soul, of spirit, right? Something's deviating from the truth, all right? Just as soon as you are experiencing anxiety relative to a situation, you could argue that's a cognitively dissonant situation, right? There's anxiety associated with cognitive dissonance, in my opinion. And you can re-experience anxiety in response to situational cues that remind of earlier traumas or difficulties, in your life, regarding relationships with your parents, for example, or teachers at school, in the early days of your education, right? But you are essentially practicing a meditation here that is of empathy-producing nature. Okay. So if it's honestly conducted therapy, it's a good thing for most people. People that, are capable of undergoing the therapy. They're stable of mind and body enough to handle the rigor of the therapy and benefit for it, right? Schizophrenia undermines the therapy because there's a loss of organization of the mind and brain, typically associated with schizophrenia. That therapies associated with that tend to, they need some place to anchor, stability-wise, mental stability-wise, to be effective. That's just kind of in a nutshell explanation of that. But armoring is an important symbolism in these two cards, okay? There's armor plating on, for example, the knight seated in the chariot, right? That indicates there's a certain amount of what you call Capricorn associated with the ego, because the ego happens to align itself or arrange itself in human experience in a manner very similar to that armor plating. The Sphinx in Fortune has control over that situation. Okay, he or she has developed sensitivities and understandings in relation to that situation, to where the armoring is appropriately controlled given the situation. All right. You can practice resilience and even to a degree a kind of toughness or callousness as is appropriate in a situation to get through a situation and not be characterologically damaged by the experience, right? Toughness of mind, strength of mind, both combine to produce a kind of resilience or momentum in dealing with situations in life, right? The momentum aspect would be particularly associated with Cancer, which in itself represents a kind of momentum, right? The tendency to continue on as is, right, is very much symbolized in these two trump cards, the whole concept of momentum. And Leo, of course, would be the astrological sign that directs or redirects that momentum usefully. There's a considerable amount of strength associated with that. Under specific circumstances, there's a natural amount of lust associated with that. But with Leo, it is all naturally tempered. And so the end result is, on a functional level, at least Virgo, which symbolizes a kind of poise, balance, preparedness, or a function brought from preparedness, or initiative, initiated appropriately to produce efficient function of appropriately peak experiential nature. Okay, you're basically running along fine in life, feeling fine, feeling normal, but periodically enough you feel just fine in life. And depression, the forces, the nature of depression is kept appropriately at bay. It is kept to heal. It is not overwhelming you. You're not caught up in unproductive rumination every day of your life. Caught up in, unproductive guilt, for example, over things that happened in the past that you wish you had handled different and what have you. You're relatively free of the things that would normally, like some kind of weird feedback system, just generate for you a depressive state or a relative stasis in life that takes on, depressive proportions to the point where you'd call it major depression, right? A different kind of momentum, or an opposite kind of momentum, compared with what I'm discussing up here in Cancer. Cancer would represent fully productive momentum associated with even physical health, but certainly constitutional health on a mental as well as physical level, right? It's easy to kind of, disappoint people that are into traditional astrology discussing these issues, because so much of what is normally deemed to be negative is heaped upon Capricorn as though that astrological sign is being demonized, but this is really just a natural arrangement. Certain things are kept in certain places so that the system remains sound overall. Okay, it remains truthful and continues to exist into the future to some manner of useful degree that, reaches beyond our ability to define exactly what is going on with it. It gets into the metaphysical that way, right? As a consideration. There are things that operate in the environment that are what you might call anti-empathetic, or at least they channel your empathetic tendencies in a manner that might be counterproductive to your own life, but certainly productive in regards controlling you by compulsory means, making it easier for these means to be exercised against you. For example, television and related popular media. You're practicing, a kind of a shaping of your empathetic interface with reality by consuming television programming, movie programming, and what have you, and other forms of, visual programming that you experience when engaged in screen time activities, right? In our time, whole big variety of screen time activities are available. they keep you sensitive to certain things, but then they promote not being sensitive to other things. And at the same time, they're callousing you the whole time you're watching, all the violence that unfolds on television or in the movies, right? You can become calloused and insensitive to it, depending on how you handle that information that you're accessing, right? So in my view, it makes sense to at least limit screen time along these lines, to the point where, one is much less of an entertainment consumer in life and more of a thoughtful analyst in life, okay? Analyzing what one is accessing, okay? In my view, syncing facilitates this because it reveals a lot of things to an analytical mind that's analyzing it. It's a form of free association, in my view, that I'm kind of studying. And because you can get a response out of those who are creating this media, it makes it even more of a study, but still there's the danger of disinformation becoming a part of that process, even at that level. So this armor factor, okay, in the knight pictured in the chariot, it is gold in color, right? So though you could say it's a Capricorn layer, like a callousing to a degree, like with the crab up there on the helmet. If you're healthy, this is brought into the constitution on a balanced or healthy level, right? So it is golden, or it is informed. It is fully and naturally informed. Okay, it is not calloused to a degree where it lacks information that it needs in a given moment, or it's lacking access to information to the degree that it can no longer pursue happiness in life. And for a human being, pursuing happiness is particularly important because it's like we both evolved ourselves and developed ourselves into pursuing happiness on a particularly sophisticated level in life. To qualify as human, there are a range of activities that need to be available to you in the pursuit of genuine happiness, in social harmony with other human beings, right? For the unforeseeable long term. That has to do with developing, genuine human morale, sensibly and reasonably developing it over time, to where we don't wipe ourselves out as a species with false pursuits of what we think of as happiness, but actually all it is empty entertainment designed to bring about self-genocide and eventually a decisive genocide taking place, right? Brought down upon a population via compulsory destructive cultism, very sophisticatedly introduced into the targeted culture, right? And then the hammer from without comes down in the end and decisively establishes slavery and or death for the targeted population. Okay, so your armor has lost its golden empathy. Okay, that gold color symbolizes fully functional and useful empathy in life, the ability to communicate with self and others. Okay, accurate communications, accurate thinking, genuine, access to genuine truth in life, soundness of mind and thinking. I'm not sure what the parade is supposed to be for today. Anyway, that's one of the things that this gold coloration of the armor is supposed to symbolize, the influence of Gemini as bringing intelligence to the Constitution and vice versa. There's like a mutual benefit, shared between dimensions going on here, right? Anyway, as you practice empathy, so then do the universes and the universe together support that practice. Okay. You'll have all kinds of experiences along these lines. It might take a long time to produce what you would experience as increased empathy or whatever. But it'll boil down to, it seems like reality kind of communicates with you and in support of you if you're really doing the right thing, right? You genuinely, for example, care. Care is an empathy practice, right? There's a certain amount of initial identification associated with it and relating going on. Object relations, it would be termed in Freudian terms, but interconnectivity developing, right? Interconnectivity is an empathy supporting process, a natural process between two people. It's communicative on an emotional level, a conceptual level, intellectual level, communicative level, right? Forming connections, right? It's like two universes are forming connections with each other. When two people are forming connections with each other, and maybe, one or both individuals over time are becoming attached to each other. Evolution has ensured, for example, attachment between a parental figure and a child is a pretty sure thing that's likely to develop under the right conditions of care. Care being provided, for example, to a young child. The child can very quickly become attached to a caregiver, a primary parental type figure. It doesn't necessarily have to be the parents. It could be, an older sibling, for example, right? And that kind of a parent and child relationship can develop there if it needs to, develop. If you take on the task associated with caring, over time a certain kind of love channel opens up of an appropriate scope relative to the nature of the care provided, right? So empathy then develops along those lines. You start to tune into, how this other individual that you're attached to or they're attached to you, how they feel, okay, on a given day. If they feel good, they feel bad. That's empathy developing, right? And compassion steps in appropriately. And when, if this individual becomes ill, the tendency is to want to alleviate the suffering because you feel the same suffering they feel, okay? And the overall mechanisms, the psychological mechanism or what's the term for it? Wheel almost. Goes through a complete cycle of action through not only you becoming aware of how somebody else feels by directly experiencing it, but how you provide, from your perspective, in the case of compassion, alleviation of suffering and promotion of that which eliminates the suffering altogether. In positive terms, hopefully not psychopathic terms or twisted terms that you sometimes see related in movies. But, basically you want to promote health for the individual, right? The child, for example, you want to be healthy, happy. Somehow this equates to the same condition for yourself, although you're not really thinking in terms of it. It's just the situation, if it's empathic, promotes it. Their health is your health, etc. It's an intelligence paradigm of a sort associated with empathy. expressing itself in real terms through this situation that is developing, ever developing probably, as it's a long-term relationship, right? So, yeah, and basically, developing relationships is anti-neurotic, okay? In Wilhelm Reich's books, for example, he talks about how very often people get caught up so much in neurosis in life that they're effectively isolated from others. In fact, organized criminal intelligence is well practiced at systematically isolating people and as a means of browbeating them down in life, right? Effectively damaging them on an empathetic level, right? They're cut off from people, and their ability to form connections with other people is carefully channeled along compulsory, destructive, cultic lines of exploitation, right? And such exploitation isn't designed to last forever. It's only designed to last for as long as you are an exploitable that they can exploit, right? So here's where we get into where empathy can be drawn into dark pentad activities on a masking level, right? Where the mask presented to you love bombs you with quote unquote empathy and interconnectivity, and ultimately a form of, you call it a dark form of attachment developing, right? Some would call it Stockholm Syndrome. There might be a certain amount of trauma bonding associated with this process too that is exploited, it being kind of a natural process. And the cult knows how to exploit these things, just like the cult knows how to exploit your tendency to form friendships with other people that you're around every day in your life, or the opposite of friendships, where you become enemies, right, under certain stressful conditions, and that can be exploited too, right? That we'll discuss as we get into Capricorn a lot more. But one is wary of the bright lights that one encounters in life, right? They might be true, they might be false lights. The relationships that develop will either last into, long-term and meaningful relationships, which indicates that the light was true that you encountered, or these relationships will tend to end, or they'll be inclined to end in short term, simply because the light isn't true, and certain underlying tendencies will start to reveal themselves through that light that are themselves very dark, in a dark pentad sense of the word, right? Certain compulsory controlling mechanisms reveal themselves, maybe initially or ultimately in the form of defense mechanisms, but at some point the mechanisms are actually quite hostile and controlling in nature, right? So I guess we can leave the discussion of empathy behind now that I'm starting to spin wheels and get outside of my scope a little bit, and start to discuss this mask factor, right? On the as pictured in the Chariot. Okay, the visor is brought down over the face. Now, previously I discussed this in terms of the mental focus. The visionary focus is focused on the body. The experiential focus is focused there, right, as a meditation. So the body is being made golden through an appropriate degree of meditative focus, right? It is, being enhanced as a communications vehicle or an intelligence vehicle. as what you might call an antenna. All right. And this influences how the mind works, and it can influence your dreams, making them, quite often come through a lot more clearly, where your behavior in the dreams is a lot more sensible, reasonable, logical, socially inclined, intellectual even. Okay. This has been my experience, casually involved in these activities myself. Not disciplined enough, though, to be much of an authority on the subject, in the sense of, being something you can surely rely on for information, I guess. It's just kind of like my own anecdotal experience along these lines, I guess you could say. So, Crowley actually kind of clues in on certain aspects of this mask, or this masking that's going on, right? He approaches it from another direction that's related in the Thoth tutorials video that I accessed on the Chariot on YouTube, where he mentions that Crowley talks of a singularity, something that is absolutely singular behind that mask, to where if you were to come face to face with it, you couldn't be anything but what it is in that moment. Though what it is pure oblivion in singularity form, as what you would call the singularity that I've been discussing for years now. And this video that I accessed, Thoth tutorial video, clued me into Eliza Crowley's own take on that whole subject, which I was unaware of before, but it only goes to show that these ideas that I've been discussing on the subject of the secret tree of alchemy have been around for a long time. Okay, very, very little of what I say on the subject is what you would call original thinking, in the sense of being some kind of great philosopher or whatever. And I've known this dating back through time, but I've been looking for confirmation of this for the longest time. And finally I've come across it, in the form of Eliza Crowley's own statements on the subject. The thing is, that's just a focus that he takes in discussing what's going on behind that mask. There are other things going on, too, behind that mask, which might be expressed in when the Kabbalists discuss Ein and Ein Sof and Ein Sof R, right? Ein, in my view, being Aries, the singularity of utmost pure oblivion, right? That some refer to as singular God, the single God that sees all and supposedly knows all. Though in reality, I would modify that to be it senses all, which is an impossibility. Thus, the concept is assigned to Aries, right? It's a practical impossibility. Nothing in practical, real nature senses all. You only need a certain degree of empathy, for example, to be functional on that level. And beyond that, you might lose yourself completely in it, right? So, yeah, you could argue that this singularity is purely empathetic, right? Or a pure empath to an impossible degree, right? But there's also Taurus going on behind that mask, which is an infinite distant point analogy in comparison with what I just discussed about the singularity in Aries. In Taurus, you run into the concept of a singularity, which you might call a 0 point of initiation of something or another. On the internet, this concept shows up as, singularities associated with events that are supposedly going to unfold, right? And then there's the fractal mathematics associated with singularity on this level, where you follow a singularity seemingly into the infinite with fractals in front of you that are mathematically describable and to some degree explainable, right? At least expressible in terms of mathematical functions, right? Ongoing, forever and ever and ever. there would be an infinite multitude of these singularities going on behind that mask that initiate what is termed spirituality. The light of spirituality being something like Gemini, which is also going on behind that mask and is also something that you can't experience because of its infinite scope, but you can conceptualize it in all kinds of ways that seem kind of crazy. For example, the Big Bang. You can conceptualize Gemini as all the Big Bangs that have ever happened and ever will happen all at once, as in terms of being an expression of light compared with the expression of darkness that goes on with Aries, right? So you got some kind of chessboard expression going on up here behind that mask, and an infinite range of infinite distant points in association with that, conceptually speaking. Again, we can only conceptualize along these lines, and it turns out we can do so reliably and in terms valid enough to produce useful mathematics and geometry. All right? And we can always return to these concepts, but we can't experience them directly except in reality form. So there's this whole concept of as above, so below. What we experience is real. What exists in the ultimate expressions of metaphysics that are completely beyond our reach, we can only, surmise as to the nature of them, right? We can infer, we can extrapolate, we can get caught up in conjecture over the issue. And if we're systematic about it, we're more reliable and valid in how we interface with these concepts. But we never experience it directly. We can think in holographic terms, right, where the hologram expresses itself as a reality, but the information is stored in some manner that is, comparatively inconceivable to us. The concepts associated with it they exist. There's a certain amount of practice associated with that and producing a hologram, of course. But that whole situation is analogous to an as above, so below situation. What goes on in Gemini, Taurus, and Aries levels of consideration, those things are just beyond our experiential reach. Except maybe via peak experience in life, where we're having thoughts along those lines that become part of our peak experience in life. Part of our intuitive interface that turns out to be valid to us, though not provable so on a scientific level. People always want to test these things scientifically, and the science is unreliable, inconclusive, typically. Though you can experience intuition, you can experience things that are seemingly inexplicable to science on a scientific level, and you can try to prove it to people and just get lost in the argument, right? Then they try to test you, it comes up inconclusive, and what is 50-50 is basically, doesn't constitute scientific evidence, right? It's just random, produces random output that can't be scientifically nailed down. Using statistical analysis methods, for example, procedures. But then there's the Capricorn factor, which is real. It tends to be very much associated with the Earth as far as situation is concerned. The Earth element being specifically assigned to Capricorn as, an elemental attribution of Capricorn, right? It's situational, though. All of the traditional elemental attributions to the astrological signs are situational. They can be, discovered to be situational, in which case you automatically think in terms of what is the self-orientation versus the situational orientation, right? Which was not my approach to discovering these things. I discovered the self-orientation first, and then eventually realized the situational attributions, right? So self-orientation for Capricorn is air elemental, okay? It's associated with mental focus. Thus we get into the concept of fence as that which divides universes from other universes. And this is somehow experienced in terms of when you focus your mental focusing faculties or imaginings or conceptualizings on the issue of what exists at the very edge of the universe, one runs into a state of confusion, relatively speaking, usually mild confusion. And, you might tune in a little bit to a bit of a resigned aspect to it that you might call maybe a little bit mildly depressive, right? Because you can't seem to come to a conclusion, right, as to what is the nature of the edge of the universe. And this is simply, ascribed or assigned categorically to Capricorn, along with other confusing things, right, or conflicted things or toxic things that have a place in nature, but nature is very careful to temper these things into an appropriate place. And when we're talking about self-orientation being air elemental, we're talking about catalysis, okay? As far as our self-development is concerned, Capricorn should be catalytic to an appropriate degree, and any more than that becomes toxic. And it just so happens, situationally speaking, Capricorn is very close to the Earth. It is between the Earth and the Moon, so to speak, right? According to the ancient alchemists. The traditional attribution of elemental attribution for Capricorn. So this then becomes part of what you might call a fence analogy that's expressed in Hebrew linguistics in their letters, assigned to Cancer. But it reaches down into Capricorn due to this confusion aspect that actually generates the whole concept in the first place. It's effectively some kind of a fence. So if we're resonating with this concept and via our own confusion and our conceptualizations, then there must be something to it on a harmonic level, a field harmonic level that constitutes fence that divides universes. So that becomes, that gets caught up in the whole empathetic process of communications between universes taking place. The whole concept of prayer, for example, having evolved or developed at least out of earlier forms of prayer that were much more physically empathetic in nature. And the stances associated with prayer were more practical along these lines of sensing the environment, right? The W shape of the arms, which became part of a whole system, at least dating back to ancient Sumeria, where, the eyebrows were symbolic of wings upon a bird or parts of a bow into which you load an arrow, right? And the arrow might shoot off into space or something, right? The eyebrows looking kind of like a bow, tensioned maybe, or not tensioned, but tensioned to a degree. This tension, though, you would associate with Capricorn, where tension as a concept is applied or assigned, right? There's tension in Capricorn. Okay. There's a phallic expression down there in the devil trump card along these lines that shoots off into space, figuratively speaking, right, in the background of this goat figure that's in the foreground of that card, right? That corresponds symbolically with the knight up in the chariot. So, yeah. And of course, Capricorn is Saturnine, which is a big planet, but it's kind of an opposite consideration of Jupiter in many people's minds, and Jupiter is assigned to Cancer. Okay, these are two big planets that are somehow opposite of each other in the secret tree of alchemy, though they're on the same side of the tree, these astrological signs, as cardinal signs or initiatives established. Through some manner of function, Cancer is established out of a function that comparatively is inexplicable and unexperienceable. Gemini, ultimately, though there's plenty of symbolic analogies that approach Gemini conceptualization, right, on a conceptual level, that will, in valid and reliable terms, be useful to us in our development of linguistics and communications and interface on realistic grounds or in realistic terms, right? That's Sagittarius, the experience of reality, and also our perception is a sign there, right? Even the aura of our bodies, our functional bodies, are assigned to Sagittarius. So the Chariot has an aura symbolized by that suit of armor, but Capricorn is wrapped up in there. And it's also a border or a fence, right? Dividing it off as a universe from other universes. So when in prayer, the hands are brought together, modern prayer in terms of being flat, right? In Christianity, at least. They touch. They interconnect the two hands, right? This implies maybe polarity, as, opposites attract, or it implies birds of a feather flock together, in the sense that the hands are kind of the same, right? They're opposites of each other, left and right, but they're also the same, right? So, but they're somehow together, as though maybe brought together or attracted together. What brings together? Integrity brings together and holds together, right? Integrity, conceptually speaking, is assigned very much to Gemini on a functional level, but somehow Aries even contributes to it, though it is pure oblivion of purely static scope, impossible to experience, impossible for it to be part of an experienced reality even. Okay. So the ego, to an appropriate degree, you could say, is a fence. There's a Capricorn aspect to that, though. It's what you would call a barrier or an obstacle, kind of a factor that has an appropriate place in nature. But if it becomes too much a part of an individual in nature, that ego can become inflamed, right? And thus threatened with instability. Thus, egocentrism becomes an issue, right? Protecting the ego at all costs, can become a factor in life experience. This becomes, inducive or, productive of things like narcissism, grandiosity in association with that, right? One is inflated, so one perceives oneself to be grand and huge, but also in need of attention for some reason, right? Maybe to an obsessive degree that you would call narcissism, a need for the attention of others to balance out one's own excessive degree of self-love, which is kind of like a way of self-medicating in the face of some form of instability that threatens the ego, right? And conceptually, you don't have an insight as to what threatens the ego. Some form of ego inflation that threatens instability and destruction of the ego. But what exactly? It could be, your own behavior bringing it on over time because your behavior is unsound. What you believe is also unsound. Your attitudes are maybe unsound. Thus, they're productive of dissonance, right? Call it cognitive dissonance if there's a certain style of discomfort associated with it, right? But dissonance on a more, shall we say, primal level has a lot to do with lack of soundness, therefore a lack of truthfulness. If you're true in nature, to a core degree, as Wilhelm Reich would say, or a healthy degree, you're producing a healthy ego which has an appropriate degree of strength relative to its interface with reality in relation to it. Okay, it's an appropriate degree of strength, appropriate degree of resilience as a result. Lust is kept in appropriate check to find productive expression at appropriate times, usually private, in relative privacy, right? So you read that book, there's a certain amount of lust associated with reading, for example, or reproduction, relations associated with that. Channeling into an appropriately healthy relationship, right? Two universes come together to create another universe. All right. Powerful energies are channeled through that, right? And the lust factor is just a catalysis that is close to the earth, that is associated with that process that nature draws up into the process. All right. Nature keeps itself going as a momentum of living scope by making appropriate use of even Capricorn level initiative established. Some would call it waste initiative, but that's only the case if it becomes excessive in degree to the point where it threatens the very integrity of the environment within which it is closely related, which happens to be the case with Capricorn. It's close to the earth, right? Nature, for example, takes deadly orgone and puts it like at the surface of the earth and just underneath the surface of the earth and in low-lying areas, if you read into orgone biophysics, right? But the result is an overcharging initially of the region that entertains maybe an excessive degree of deadly orgone. And that's inflative in nature, but also ultimately destructive, causing a certain kind of disintegration of reality itself to where, material objects start to be, turn into a powder. They disintegrate, literally. Setting up a combination of orgone accumulators and cloud busting equipment operating on and off in a given region, for example, can bring about damage to the infrastructure in that region. Okay, concrete becoming, crumbly and powdery, that sort of thing. All right. In comparison with orgone, which is much more in touch with the overall cosmos, pulsating and flowing through, the sky, even the aura of the earth surrounding this deadly orgone situation, which is kind of pressed down close to the surface of the earth, probably does not even come close to penetrating to the core of the earth, right? It's just kept in its place. And we can find ourselves swimming in it to a destructive degree, right? So nature has a way of recycling all this back into the rest of nature, or basically flushing it down what you would call the cosmic toilet, as though through a black hole down into Aries, where somehow maybe it disappears altogether or is transformed somehow. You could argue interdimensionally, but scientifically you can't even touch that yet. Science hasn't even touched seriously the cosmic ether or ether, or whatever the pronunciation is. I've only read on these issues. I'm not sure whether I want to say ether or ether. Ether, I think that's a chemical, right? So maybe I should just say ether. I want to say ether, so I'll just say ether from now on. Of course, the pure cosmic ether in its most serene expression as a Cancer analogy, but in its pulsating and flowing form, which can be much more easily perceived, it's a Libra analogy. But in regards being manifest stasis on an energetic level, tends to produce or induce depressive states, including depressive states of mentality, but also activity in life. All right? It could result in major depression and related destruction of mind and body over time, ultimately becoming maybe schizophrenic in the meantime. So that's a destructive process too. There are physiological disintegrations often associated with the process of schizophrenia taking hold of somebody as a mental disorder, right? Now, discussing the whole issue of sadomasochism, which is something that nature channels in the direction of keeping it tempered in Capricorn, right? There's the danger in discussing this issue, right? And the very idea that nature manages such things. There's the danger of discussing it in such a way that people think it's a good idea to actually practice it. That's a really complex issue to get into, but one thing's for certain, I'm a firm believer that it is supremely unwise to practice sexual sadomasochism of any kind, right? The reason being is the energies associated with sexuality are powerful, and they are amplified expressions of spirituality and energy and ideation and emotion, to the point where, practicing sadomasochism relative to that situation is like playing Russian roulette to a suicidal degree. To a certainty of suicide, I guess you could say, in time. Which you could say that about Russian roulette, I guess. But the way to approach the whole issue of sexuality is by way of Cancer, to be safe, Though this isn't something nature considers to be an absolute certainty. Sometimes, people just get together on a sexual level because it happens, right? So usually it's from a Cancer perspective, even for something like a one-night stand. There's a interconnectivity developing between two people that becomes sexual, sometimes with a quickness, and that's perfectly natural. It's easy to get caught up in moralistic considerations in discussing these issues too, and genuine morality has much to do with genuine human morale, maintained through time. So one-night stands are not out of the question. Sometimes they support human morale, thus they're perfectly moral. Okay, this religious concept of compulsory sexual morality has more to do with controlling people exploitatively than anything else, right? It has to do with maintaining the cult and the state more than with maintaining human morale. So, of course, venereal disease is not exactly good for human morale either, right? But it exists. It is an important consideration in life. So there's a certain amount of risk associated with sexual expression in life, and that never really completely goes away, as a lot of people can readily understand from their own experiences, right? Whether it's just, unwanted pregnancy or a venereal disease, or the psychological trauma associated with, sexually interfacing with somebody that turns out to be monstrous to interface with for whatever reason. So just by, natural default, the Cancer approach to human sexuality tends to be safer than the Capricorn approach, which could very easily turn sadomasochistic or toxic on some level or another, right? The idea of social inclusion and social interaction being the basis of sexual relationship development, it tends by natural default simply to be safer and more effective in producing lasting relationships that help the species to reproduce without producing monstrous personalities in the process of doing it. If I get too specific discussing this issue, it almost sounds like I'm trying to moralize on people, but nature arranges things a certain way and also has arranged things so that people discover on their own how nature works in freedom, right? Relative freedom, which means quite often socially shared and experienced freedom, right? People have the capacity to get together enthusiastically, quite often sharing information about such issues as this, which just so happen to become, by natural default, cultic in a social expression, right? People form cultic organizational tendencies around these issues of coming together and sharing information, right? So, and that can be turned on its head via organized crime influences to become compulsory destructive in scope, where you get into what are termed to be destructive cults and what are termed in other circles to be compulsory religion, where the cult is imposed upon you in life, usually most effectively, at least in early childhood and through the formative years, to produce a cultic personality of compulsory destructive scope, which will naturally, you might say, or unnaturally impose itself upon others, not only cultically but sexually, and imposing upon people sexual moralism to go along with religious moralism and other forms of behavioral moralisms that turn out to be disinformation systems where good ideas are mixed with bad ideas and then imposed as a package on people. Whereas if you give me this, then you got to give me that. Problem is that turns out to be untrue compared with this, right? And they want to hit you with a whole package and draw you into the cult and then make you dependent on the cult to an appropriate degree that maintains the cult for the long term. Things which are deemed to be destructive cults tend not to last as long. Think Manson family, right? That's not going to be around for centuries, you could argue, compared with a compulsory cult that becomes a major religion that is around for centuries and centuries and has a huge legacy dating back in time of both trauma and even murder, to include mass murder, right? And war, deemed to be holy war in nature. Any group of people that talk about holy war are talking about wicked, organized crime, in my view. Taking dominance over people via the mechanisms associated with war. The various intelligence vehicles associated with that, which are dark in scope, as far as dark pentad goes. So Capricorn, compared with Cancer, is ultimately destructive in its influence. So it has to be tempered because Capricorn never seems to go away. And Cancer, you want to keep around as long as possible, right? That's the universe, right? It's your constitution, right? So one learns appropriate degrees of temperance practiced in life, okay, to maintain health for life, for as long a life as possible, right? You're keeping your own bodily and spiritual constitution together with, healthy integrity for a long life, knowing that ultimately this Capricorn factor is going to do you in as you age, right? Capricorn tends to be associated with age. Even the goat figure in The Devil in Crowley's version, looks rather aged, right? It's got white hair, and it seems to have an interest in you as it looks at you, right? But we'll get into that when we discuss that trump card. So as near as I can tell, the Cancer trump cards only barely touch upon the idea of dominance and versus submission that you would associate with sadomasochism, right? And the scope of expression in that card is specifically, shall we say, non-sexual. Or if it is suggestive along these lines, it's very subtle suggestion along those lines compared with the devil, which is particularly sexual and phallic at the same time, right? You could also say that the fact that the moon is exalted in Cancer lends that particular trump card, the Chariot, a rather vaginal quality. You know, the blood in the cup and all that kind of stuff, right? Associated with menstruation, right? Which is associated with the night. And the Crowley deck is a nighttime deck, right? So, yeah, those cards barely touch upon any such idea as dominance and submission. It's more like, a conditioning expressed as a momentum, where those figures at the bottom, at the feet of the charioteer, the armored charioteer, are naturally at heel. They're not being beaten upon to be there. It seems to be the result of some meditative practice of some kind that conditions a certain way to where you're naturally tempered, and it seems like those creatures are very well cared for. And the individual cares for himself equally well. His suit of armor is shined. His faculties are all shined up stone, even though some of the stones are sooty dark, the ones that seem to be associated with past incarnations that are turned to the side, right? That's a common symbol of incarnation, of the reincarnation, I guess you could say, where things are turned, angled compared with other things. It's you're taking a different path when you reincarnate, as though you just went around a corner and got onto another street or something, right? But there's no suggestion of bondage, okay, in the card. There aren't even reins in the Chariot, right? There are no reins that control those creatures down there. It's as though everything in that card is free to express itself, and it expresses itself a certain way that is conditioned from out of some kind of a perspective you'd call freedom, right? This individual, the charioteer, conditioned itself in freedom to be an expression along the lines that it expresses. You could even call it a funerary expression from a certain perspective, a certain golden perspective, right? Having lived a golden life as a conditioning born of free association, free expression, free communications between universes or whatever, right? Fence line, properly maintained, even though it's Capricorn in scope. It's golden, it's informed, it's full of light, it's sound, it's complete, it covers the entire universe uniformly, gorgeously uniformly, you might say, all golden and shined, and everything. Reflective of something as though a magic mirror. It's got its 10 sapphires concretely expressed that correspond with the 10 flows that were expressed in Fortune, as though Fortune were the previous incarnation of this individual. During its lifetime, it learned lessons. Any dominance and submission expressed in the Fortune trump card is, again, minimal at best, and really has a lot to do with situation and struggles to gain understanding. But there isn't that much struggle going on in that card compared with the devil, right? The thing that is attached to the earth somehow is having a good time, being confused about, the objects it's carrying in its hands, the Ankh thing and the other thing. And it's just kind of toying around with them the way infants toy around with ideas and objects, playing with them, not really understanding them, but imitating maybe what they see going on in the environment around them. And it's about to turn a corner, so to speak, down there at the bottom of the Wheel of Fortune to maybe begin climbing where that monkey figure, turtle monkey figure, or whatever it is, climbing actively without its tail attached to anything on any kind of involuntary or misunderstood level. This thing understands some things about physics, including, not only metaphysics, but maybe quantum physics expressed in that tail. The spiral shape of the tail, symbolic of spirit, but maybe quantum physics too, right? Its armor is kind of on its back as though it's being managed there, in a protective fashion similar to the cape seen on the charioteer, right? It almost looks like a turtle shell, right? It's in the process of learning lessons. It protects itself appropriately in the environments that it interfaces with, right? The fence line is kept intact and useful and productive, right? And then the fence line expressed on the Sphinx up there is just over the breasts, to make a presentation like it's kind of a mask, but the face is fully revealed through it. And there's kind of a focus going on, like a mental focus off into the distance, symbolizing various forms of object relations outwardly expressed or focused or interfaced with, right? So dominance and submission is really just a matter of relative arrangement to where, there's an authoritative figure at the top of that wheel, but it's not domineering over anyone. It simply has experience that allows it to sit where it sits on top of that wheel. Okay? It's a matter of it developing. Therefore, it has knowledge. Therefore, it has genuine authority, you could say. It's in no position to tell anybody else what to do, but what it can express is sound to the point of being useful to other people. So other people make use of that information by nature. There's no browbeating going on. There's no hostility expressed in any of these two cards. No confinement expressed in this card, really. It's like the universe is this open, comparatively open expression of nature going on here. These are universal expressions of symbolism, right? Compared with what's going on with the devil down there in Capricorn, but we'll get into that later. In regard to these mixed up animal figures at the feet of the charioteer, right? The charioteer being a fully human form with its fence line fully intact and everything. This is an above expression that also captures the nature of the below expression in the form of these figures that are all mixed up together, that in being mixed up, you could say they can express Capricorn state of confusion, but this is a very orderly expression of symbolism here, right? Which means that this quote-unquote confusion going on with these figures down the bottom of the card are particularly well-informed. They're organized, right, into a productive expression of some kind, established as an initiative, but not really expressing itself actively just yet, right? It's as though they're prepped and ready to do something, probably outside the house. This being a house expression, but also a vehicle expression, right? So these figures down at the bottom can express Gemini ideas, the number 10, being the decimal sequence number assigned to Gemini, implying such concepts as multiplication in, everyday kind of terms, right? Mundane terms for Gemini, but multiplication is not a mundane thing, right? It's a very powerful thing. It's associated with sexual relations, for example, and reproduction. Capricorn happens to be particularly well expressive of such ideation, right? Associated with relations and reproduction. So it has its place in that process. But number 10 for Capricorn is spiritually empowered. Okay. It's assigned to Capricorn simply because it's part of a sequence associated with creation, including its evolutionary aspects and deliberately bred aspects, right? If you're going to talk about reproduction and how death relates to those processes, right? Either nature selects an animal to breed or something else does, like a human factor that, effectively owns the animal, right? So we select ourselves as human beings to breed, right? Or maybe we die unexpectedly, so evolution is at work. But deliberate breeding is also at work. And you could argue that destiny is an influence upon the breeding process, where fates, including ultimate fate, might cut that process short of success in regards reproduction, right? So we get into divine thinking or metaphysical thinking to the degree that such considerations escape the conditional scope of science. And we get into the philosophies, where philosophy can effectively reign supreme by default, even though it might be drastically underfunded compared with certain scientific disciplines, right? So basically, when you're comparing Capricorn to Gemini, you're comparing different ways of basically being mixed up, okay? This can result in confusion, but confusion is more of a Capricorn condition. Gemini comparatively lends a certain style of integrity that you would call relationships. Okay, it is relationships. Therefore, it promotes relationships. Therefore, it promotes integrity between individuals. Call it social integrity. Integrity shared between individuals, right? Now, somehow Taurus contributes to this on an initiation level, and Aries also does on an initiative level, a previously established initiative level of some kind, that we tend to extrapolate out conceptually as the singularity. But Gemini, in comparison, would be all the singularities, right? Thinking in those terms is just, we get lost in confusion. Thus, the fence comes up as though, some kind of protective issue relative to that situation. It's Capricorn in nature, but it's automatically right off the bat tempered, okay? Because your considerations, conceptually speaking or intellectually speaking, are reaching up into the metaphysics. So the Capricorn that arises in response to that is comparatively harmless if you're genuinely trying to get up in there and consider things, right? You're doing your best to be truthful, and you're happening across what you could argue are valid and reliable concepts, but you can't prove it to others. It's just something you experience for yourself in your thinking, right? But you become confused at some point that, has been described in the past as quote-unquote fence. A fence comes up. That fence would be part of the process of you maintaining your mental integrity in the face of these higher aspects of reality. You could argue, and only argue, really, or only, shall we say, posit or present along the lines of describe more than explain. But you become confused at some point, and then you just kind of back off, and then you just kind of back to your own realistic stance in life. You've been engaged in prayer, you might argue, without realizing it. And prayer is basically a symbolic thing that's expressed. I haven't looked into the Muslim expression of prayer specifically, but it involves the floor, typically an Aries symbol, and bottom-up posturing relative to the floor. You could argue that's a militant posture. Any posture taken, you could argue, or any stand taken, can take on militant connotations, It's difficult, though, for that to take place with two hands brought together, but humans seem to have found a way to do that, okay? Masochism as an imposition on a cultic scale, which happens to channel through Christianity pretty heavily, in my view. It's a mass suicide cult, basically, but the suicide is an ultimate expression that takes place down the road, right? Even in destructive cults. So then this fencing can be rearranged into various forms of masking, right? Which is a behavior for humans. It's natural to a degree. It's an evolved way of humans basically greasing the wheels of social interaction on an initial scale. When you first get together with somebody, typically there's a certain amount of polite masking that naturally takes place, right? The tendency is not to say things that are easily misunderstood. You'll know you're interfacing with somebody who's crazy, though, if even when you're, being polite and then eventually developing a relationship, where if they misunderstand what you said, they suddenly go nuts and become dangerous. Then you know what you're dealing with, right? But the tendency when first getting together is to be relatively polite and cordial and not excessively intimate in your communications, right? But this tends to grease the wheels of developing a relationship. But masking can take on, because it's a Capricorn consideration, inflated and centric qualities and grandiose qualities, megalomaniacal qualities in time, right? Where somehow maintaining that mask is tantamount to maintaining your very psychological integrity in life. Because somehow your ego or your mental integrity is at threat. And you don't have insight as to why that's the case. That makes everything even more threatening, like it's a feedback system, right? So, yeah, Capricorn is something to be handled with temperance. And temperance, appropriately practiced requires a certain amount of insight and experience and knowledge to be able to practice it. You learn these practices from the examples of the more experienced people around you during your formative years, especially early childhood. If your parents are not particularly tempered individuals, but are, their temperament tends to be unpredictable and even dangerous, you're likely to take on those qualities yourself. You're going to internalize those qualities and even identify with them to a degree, whether you know that's taking place or not, whether you can even remember it ever happened. Okay? If you had a sadistic father, for example, that sadism is internalized within you somewhere. Even if you were, raised such that, you became a masochist at face value in life, which is what typically happens with Christians. Everyday face value tends to be, shall we say, compulsory meek, right? Turn the other cheek, though you really shouldn't in some situations, right? What lies beneath that, though? Well, sadism does. And you could argue the opposite for Muslims, where at face value, they tend to be more sadistic, more openly sadistic. What lies at the foot of that? Well, masochism, internalized, but also expected from the environment, especially from those deemed to be required to be, prostrated on a masochistic level, namely women, right? But these women still internalize that conditioning of sadism they experienced growing up at the feet of their fathers, right? That is internalized, okay, and can find ready expression under the right circumstances. So, yeah, these cultural considerations get really complex. You might argue in a holographic analogous fashion of consideration, but at some point, to be productive, you got to conceptualize in relatively abstract terms what's going on in order for you to create an effective map of what's going on a chronic level. Something chronic or characterologically concrete is going on here. And you got to be able to map it out effectively. The secret tree of alchemy happens to be one map amongst many that can be applied to this situation. The secret tree of alchemy, in particularly broad terms, though, compared with the more concisely utilitarian maps associated with the various fields of psychology, which very often turn out to be, useful approaches to the same problems. Okay? And they're applied as are appropriate to apply to a given situation, right? That you would call psychological disorder for an individual personality undergoing analysis in the clinical environment of whatever design that has been developed that has proven to be of any value at all in that kind of a situation. Usually people specialize in different kinds of problems like borderline personality disorder, particularly difficult personality disorders are particularly difficult to treat, and borderline personality disorder happens to be one that does find its way into a clinic, usually under circumstances dangerous to the client, or at least initially dangerous to the client, with an ongoing danger of, suicide being an issue, right? But other forms of personality disorder are only supremely difficult to treat, in my view, because it's so difficult to get them into a clinical setting in the first place. I think everything can be treated over time. The brain is neuroplastic, right? So you can develop dendrites that you need on that, level to develop the personality traits you really need in life to, for example, develop empathy in life. If you're atrophied on that level, okay, on a brain physiology level, for example, you can develop your neuroplasticity in the direction of developing empathy by practicing certain things that I've been discussing right here, right? Psychoanalysis being one practice that can be undertaken. There are some wealthy people out there that are psychopathic that could benefit from psychoanalysis. Although, if they've been criminally involved, this becomes a lot more difficult because to stay out of jail, you have secrets that you want to keep even from a therapist. Because therapists are required to communicate with law enforcement if certain things arise in the clinical setting, right? So how do you get a young psychopath into the clinic? Number one, they probably can't afford it. Psychoanalysis is expensive, but starting psychoanalysis at like age 12 to 16 is almost ideal because chances are you haven't been criminally involved, or if you have, it's been something relatively petty, right? So you can start the process of building an empathetic character and personality to, as kind of like, something new that you've learned to effectively at least replace what was before a calloused and even maybe sadistic personality with something better, that still has the ability to stand its ground in life under, appropriately under various, hostile circumstances. So this masking, right, in my view, tends to take on a layered quality as expressed in the Chariot with that red cloak to the outside world along his backside, right? So yeah, he kind of corresponds with that monkey figure in Fortune that way. It's got a tortoise shell or something on his back there. So, yeah, that outer, layer tends to be for putting your best foot forward, right? But that also tends to be the most shallow expression of personality in life. But you want it to be effective, right? You're trying to grease the wheels of social interaction and all that kind of stuff. But if you're smart, you're not trying to mislead somebody who is not an enemy, right? Enemies, of course, in combat have to be, misled all the time, right? But if you're trying to make friends with people in the world, you don't want to mislead them, but you also want to put a best foot forward. It greases the wheels of social interaction. Some kind of relationship might spontaneously develop out of it, right? But yeah, if the masking is layering itself, chances are there's something criminal in the background going on behind those appearances, that best foot forward factor, right? Maybe a hidden desire to exploit somebody where, while they're being friendly with you, they're sizing you up for maybe, exploiting you on some level or another, taking advantage of you or harming you even, right? This can become characterological, or this masking tendency to maintain this stable persona in life on a social interactive level becomes characterological and layered in a neurotic fashion, right? And the underlying layers tend to be criminally inclined more often than not, if not outright criminally inclined due to a relative lack of hostile force involved, right? Then they're depressively inclined or self-destructively inclined, right? This thing behind the mask might desire to end its own life and maybe take you along with it, as its way of expressing hostility in the world, right? So the mask in a healthy situation more often should correspond with a healthy core expression communicative in the world, with self and others, right? We communicate with ourselves, we communicate with others. Free association is the best way to practice that sort of thing. And free association is a terminology that's got very many interpretations associated with it. Freudian interpretations, but also freely associating with other people interpretations. So when you're raising children, you take the risk of allowing them to freely associate with others, but under careful, watch to a degree that's useful for the development of the child, right? And you cross your fingers and hope the best at the same time. Hope being one of those things that's out of Taurus rather than Capricorn. It's kind of the opposite of belief, really, hope is. And Taurus and Capricorn are opposites in many respects, being on the absolute opposite ends of the tree, but they share similarities. So hope and belief share similarities, but they're also opposites of each other. Hope rarely becomes the devil, except in the sense of it disappearing altogether, right? Whereas belief becomes the devil, it seems, too often in this world, associated with ego inflation and egocentrism and grandiosity and ultimately sadism and psychopathy and even Machiavellianism, right? So belief is one of those things to temper very carefully and sensibly. Okay. Cancer practice, care. Sagittarius practice. Serious sense and sensibility and appropriateness given to the situation at hand, right? So at this deeper level of consideration, masking very often involves survivalistic tendencies, which might be kept occult of expression or covert of expression for various reasons, having to do either with characterology, where the occult aspect is characterological. Maybe the individual expressive of it, potentially at least, has no idea it even exists. But if it's covert, that means it's consciously kept hidden, which means criminality might be afoot, right? This survivalist you're talking to, right? For the first time you're talking to this individual, he's very friendly and charming, or she is, and then wham, down comes a hammer on your head, and you're robbed blind somehow or another, right? Survival is a deeper layer of deeper layer of potentially explosive hostility or toxic hostility, and cynical depression hyphen resignation I wrote down here. Depression, resignation, okay, cynicism can take on a hostility, even an unexpected hostility where, they think their ship is going down, so they decide they're going to take you down with it. They will derive some manner of satisfaction from that. They're just becoming aware of it just as they're about to do themselves in, or who knows? I mean, there's all kinds of weird thinking confused thinking that can go on here, right? So this masochism versus sadism, right? Either can be at the forefront in this, background layer of masking, right? Where the most superficial layer is very friendly, typically polite at the very least. But underneath the surface, sadism might be at the forefront, or masochism might be at the forefront. Maybe this thing's afraid of you, right? It's about ready to prostrate itself in front of you, or it's at least tempted to, but it's holding back from that expression, being friendly instead, maybe, testing the situation out. But masochism is more shallow in orientation. So if this thing that you're facing is masochistic, it's unaware on many of the same levels you might be unaware on, in facing this thing. It lacks self-awareness. It thinks itself maybe even angelic. In its meekness, it's rather, shall we say, shallowly amplified meekness in life. Putting on a very turn the other cheek air, right? And presenting itself as part of its presentation, or something you see in the background going on there that effectively veils maybe an underlying hostility that is sadistic in nature, but both parties in the conversation are unaware of it, right? This to me is a common condition in Christian circles, right? Where that underlying sadism, once it finally expresses itself, it is freaky and quote-unquote occult or cultic, with all the weird expressions that go along with it. And even there might be some people around that know what's going on, and they're shooting the gang signs of, cultic involvement along, goat networking lines. Well, somebody's being lynched, or maybe you got a whole line of people that are being lynched or something. It's some terrible thing going on that can happen under these circumstances. You got aware people that just exploit the whole situation and even promote it because they're trying to bring down a nation, right? And they're trying to produce a hoax in association with all these trials, these court proceedings, and resulting capital punishments, right? These things can happen, and you, as a group of people, were taken along a path unaware of where you were being taken, right? The ultimate destination you did not envision until it was too late. But if sadism fronts that inner layer, right, that underlying truthfulness of criminal scope, right? Okay, this thing is aware, comparatively speaking, all right? It's aware of the situation. It's sizing the situation up more accurately than masochistic mind is, or best foot forward mind is, right? There's a certain amount of productive truth associated with sadism, I guess you could say, where, they're somewhat justified quite often in thinking themselves superior in, for example, intelligence compared with the masochists that they have prostrating at their feet, or maybe you, who is haplessly coming into contact with these people, right? As a prospective cult member, maybe, right? You're lacking information compared with this sadistic thing that is standing in front of you. And if you're empathetic, you probably can tune into what's going on with those eyes looking at you. The ones that are portrayed down in The Devil in Capricorn, right? Where, at first, oh, what is it's looking at me? Is it dangerous? Chances are, yeah. But are there indicators to the effect? Chances are they are contextual in nature, and you're not cluing into them at all just yet. But maybe you will start to clue into them about the time you're walking into a trap. All right? So sadism has a certain kind of intelligence associated with it. You can say the same thing about masochism, but masochism is even more deceptive and roundabout in how it ultimately expresses itself, right? Mass suicide, masochism, right? It's an important part of a suicide cult, masochism is. Prostrating yourself to a leader to that degree where you're willing to do yourself in just to fit in. I mean, how aware exactly is that compared with the sadist who is going to run off with all the money? Or if he perceives he can't run off with all the money, he's going to run off with all the notoriety as having been a cult leader or something of infamous scope, right? He's going to get all that attention as far as he's concerned. That provides him with a certain amount of satisfaction compared with you, who are, shall we say, an unmentioned schmuck in the situation. Just an underling that did the mass suicide thing along with cult leader who had to have an associate put a bullet in his head. Okay. And then, I don't know, make it look like a suicide or something. You never know about how these things are going to unfold. Sometimes your second in command is even more sadistic and intelligent than the commander, right? So, yeah, this consideration of relative shallowness is kind of shaky, I realize, but to me, shallowness is associated with a relative lack of awareness, okay? A relative lack of inner awareness and awareness of what's going on around you, especially when contextual cues are revealing themselves to those who are open to that level of communication, right? Empathy operates integrally, in my view, with genuine intelligence. Unfortunately, that also includes criminal intelligence. So Mr. Sadist there is probably a little bit more empathetic than people would give him credit for, being psychopathic and everything. He's what you might call selectively calloused in life, compared with Mr. Masochist over there, who's more seriously calloused, and where his sadism is likely to take control over his behavior rather unexpectedly, even from his experiential perspective, compared with Mr. Sadist here. Much more calculating, right? Yeah, down in The Devil, Capricorn, that phallic thing that actually symbolizes Devil's Tower in eastern Wyoming, as well as the trunk of a tree, right? That thing is what you would call concrete. It is expressive of a certain characterology in the background of this thing that is looking at you. It's if it's looking at you, it's identifying with you on some level. There's empathy at work on some level. If it's alive, it's got some manner of empathy. Okay? So take that for what it's worth for now. I'll discuss that in more detail when I discuss Capricorn. So when you study psychology from people like Wilhelm Reich, right, you get into this whole idea of, mapping out what is considered to be core human nature versus armored human nature, characterologically speaking, right? If you think of characterology as something that has developed concrete qualities as an expression of libidinally based momentum expressed in the world, right? Where core considerations are direct expressions from the center of your being, right? And his assumption is the center of your being is, it can't help but be socially inclined. That means desirous of coming into contact on a relational level with other beings of like kind at the very least, or sometimes opposite kind. You're talking about the sexes, right? Libra is heavily involved in opposites getting together, right? In response to Capricorn, by the way. It's much more magnetic, animal magnetic, you might say. Opposites getting together. That's typically involved in the process. Even outside scope considerations with reproduction. It tends to be associated with reproduction, even when it is initiated on a social level. Opposites getting together, right? The potential for reproduction is there. Relations associated with that, right? But people of like kind getting together, that's a more primary way that the universes relate things with other things, right? So, it's particularly primal in an everyday sense. Birds of a feather flock together. It's a truth that more often applies than opposites attract, but opposites in our world are attracted to each other all the time, right? And sometimes under very negative circumstances. But like getting together with like tends to be quite often positive on a social level, or simply an object relations level where you're interfacing with a material object or something that you relate to, maybe identify with somehow, right? That can happen. But more so often, relations of an important scope tend to involve other beings of like kind to yourself, other human beings if you're human, right? But sometimes other animals that you have for pets or whatever. But the tendency is to relate and also identify with. Okay, these things happen immediately when you're relating. So the goal of therapy is to be able to relate core to core on a most social level possible, right? You're just socializing with another being. And it's a direct core expression from the core of your being to the core of their being and vice versa. This is empathy practiced on a most productive scale, okay? You can think of it as a vector from the core of yourself, reaching out and coming into contact with the core of another being, right? Like an arrow pointing out, and it successfully makes contact. Contactfulness, as Wilhelm Reich would call it, right? This is an impossible ideal to a degree, but it is a useful ideal to, keep in mind as a goal. A mapping, a relative abstract terms, right? That has goal orientation associated with it. Goal orientation associated with it. There, I said it right. So there are all kinds of complications, though, that can get in the way of that core to core. Because when people become neurotic, core expressions become reduced in scope, or shall we say, calloused at first and then atrophied out of existence later. That's the neurotic process of destruction of soul taking place, right? And it's a momentum that builds up, and it builds up because of practices taken on in the interest of survival during infancy, okay? You have to survive being raised in an unnatural household, for example. Very poor examples for parents who also lash out violently towards intimate others. They are infinite, first and foremost, in privacy, the privacy of a home, for example. Any number of things violent can take place, right? Without the world around knowing much about it. Well, infants typically have to survive these things, and they have to callous themselves to the environment and other people in that environment to protect the integrity of their minds, the constitutional integrity of their minds and their brains and their bodies, right? So they can continue to live. It's a survival thing. So they anesthetize themselves on that level and then develop appropriate for survival amnesic tendencies where they forget things have ever happened, right? This anesthetization and amnesia go hand in hand together. It operates integral with muscular armoring that builds up because people tense their muscles to keep themselves from experiencing pain, right? So you're doing that quite a lot as an infant raised in an unnatural household, okay? And it becomes like a chronic momentum where the muscular armoring takes on chronic scope, and at first it's painful, but eventually you don't feel it at all, and then you forget all of the situations associated with the development of that armoring, right? They disappear into some background. This is what MK Ultra takes advantage of in its conditioning of people, by the way. JSK, for example, severely muscularly armored through life to a degree that though he stabilized as an individual, he does not express compulsion in a rigid, straight fashion that other compulsives express themselves. He was taken beyond that point. He should be highly unstable, maybe schizophrenic, but they solidified some kind of character structure together for this person, right? It's just misshapen enough, but he survives anyway, so it's not so misshapen, at least in youth, although he is not to age well. These kinds of situations just don't age well. Any kind of compulsive characterology does not age well. It can take on a beatific quality in youth, though, especially if it survives in an evolutionary sense, right, and can reproduce itself. Unfortunately, the culture is also something handed down between generations, right, along with characterology. The tendency is to treat your own children the way you were treated, and you think it's a good thing, especially if you're a garden variety compulsive type, as Wilhelm Reich would describe. Okay? So, yeah, this is part of what calluses people to developing genuine and truthful and sound empathy in life. Thus, their very intelligence is compromised, too. Okay? Empathy and intelligence go hand in hand. Okay? Your body and your mind together are an intelligence vehicle. Empathy is integral with that process. Okay? There's no escaping it. If you're calloused at all, your intelligence is compromised in life. Okay, you're missing out on information that the environment typically communicates to you. You might even become obsessed over that if you're criminally inclined, and you got to know all and be all. Okay, to the point where you're so megalomaniacal in your grandiosity and narcissism that you've got people prostrating at your feet on compulsive grounds or in compulsive terms, or on compulsory grounds or in compulsory terms. They are made to do so if you happen to be the head of an organized criminal cultic situation, right? So, yeah, that's to the degree you can get away with it, by the way, before the cult decides it's going to get rid of you. So these people are typically walking a fine line in their own, way of going about doing things to survive. The survival thing just goes on and on and on since birth. And your average psychopath, for example, typically just doesn't wind up in a clinic as much as in a jail cell or in a coffin. Or they just wind up in charge of corporation. Their funerary expression in life involves being a CEO. And they become like a criminal expression of that charioteer there, right? They're burying themselves in their lifestyle and possessions as head of a corporation that they're tearing to pieces at the same time, right? It's a schizophrenic corporate expression of sadistic or sadomasochistic scope, I should say, right? So, the criminal tends to be what complicates things. It's integral with the armoring, the muscular armoring, the conflict. They love to produce chaos and conflict on their terms so they can control things, right? Just like a military does, right? Every criminal organization is an army at war with the people around it, okay? Holy war, whatever, exploitation, shaking people down in the streets for money. The whole gambit of what organized criminal organizations do, or terrorist organizations, what they do, right? If you have a legitimate army up to defend your nation, it can very easily become corrupted. Although armies take longer to corrupt compared with smaller organizations like special forces or police organizations, which can become corrupt at the speed of light, it seems like, very quickly forming themselves into pyramidal schemes of compulsory control and tyranny, right? So then we get into the consideration when we're talking about empathy with schemata, or how a schema becomes accessible of mind in response to situational cues. Okay? You become blind to certain things in a schema that other people are interfacing with along with you compared with other people when you lack empathy. That runs integral with, you not being able to tune into another person. Well, just like you can't tune into another person on an emotional level, for example, being a true empath, you can't tune into yourself on that level, and you can't tune into the situation on that level, or on a variety of levels, an understanding level, for example, and an insight level. So a schema that turns out to be, shall we say, character, typically we'll say lethal to people, might arise, and you are blind to it, compared with Mr. Anxious type over there that's already running for his life. All right, and you're looking at him and you're passing judgment on that individual. You coward! Why are you running? Why are you scared? And then the gunshots go off, right? Oh, it's a dangerous situation. That's just one kind of an example of what I'm talking about here. But you have schemata, which is, you can think of as the matrix of schemas stored in your mind, right? You develop this mapping of reality in your mind that you call it a matrix form of, storing maps away. Just like a captain on a ship keeping his maps rolled up and all on a shelf up there that he can pull a chart out, I should say. Put it on the table of his rocky ship and, and chart out a course. Well, the mind works in a similar way in storing schemas away, or schemata away, I should say. A schema is stored in its own little shelf until it's needed. The situational cues that arise, just like for a captain on a ship, will dictate how the mind will make that schema relatively more accessible to mind compared with others. And there are expectations in your mind that arise relative to a situation that is unfolding, right? Based upon your own individual experience, but also based upon evolutionary factors that humans have experienced in the past and have survived and reproduced despite of, right? So that's evolution at work in this overall process. So persona then is differentiated from overall personality. Persona is something you front as a masking, right? Tendency. Carl Jung's a good source of information on this subject. I think it might be Freudian too, but I have not read enough into Freud as of yet. So, yeah, it's the tendency to mask in social settings to an appropriate degree, I guess, if you're healthy. But then your overall personality is differentiated from persona to a degree, right? Relative to present schema, okay? But if you're neurotic, there's even more of a disparity between persona and personality. Aspects of your personality can be lost to your own individual conscious experience under those conditions, right? Being amnesic and anesthetic in nature, neurosis is. This is a mechanism associated with losing effective awareness relative to a schema, okay? A typical situation, I should say, and a schema go hand in hand. And let's see what we're looking at here before I get into Capricorn. I had so many ideas rolling across my mind, and I only got some of them written down. And, this whole field is worth looking into. You can develop empathy in life for yourself. If you've got the courage, right? If you're psychopathic, though, you're less likely to take on the challenge of it, simply because you perceive yourself to be profiting to the utmost from your present condition, right? At least until you wind up in prison, or you wind up dead, or, it's rare to get psychopaths into the clinic, just like it's rare to get reliable, compulsive types that consider themselves to be the pillars of society into a clinical setting. Though very often these people become clinicians, right? Of, in my view, relatively limited value, except under what you would call emergent conditions, where they can intervene, in a manner that's of practical use in the moment to keep people from maybe becoming dangerous to self or others, and they can counsel and those kinds of things. So I don't mean to knock people too much along those lines, but I don't consider myself to be potentially very much of a therapist in life for other people, because I'm so heavily involved in my own personal self-therapy in life. I have not developed as much as a therapist on a face-to-face level, I don't know if it's in the cards for my life at all. So it's something that, in my view, has to be a calling that reveals itself to you in life, right? And the value of your own individuality relative to that schema would need to reveal itself. And such things reveal themselves in a variety of ways, right? But the idea here is to avoid, in developing empathy and cancer-centered qualities in life, you're trying to avoid processes of putrefaction and disintegration on an alchemical level from taking hold of your life. These tend to be strongly associated with Capricorn and Aries, whereas Aries is the pure oblivion, where you're just flat out gone. Capricorn is the process of disintegration into that state. And it takes its own analogy, holographic analogy form, right? As part of the chemical considerations going on here with these tarot cards in the Secret Tree of Alchemy. And I'm trying to make sure I cover all of Cancer here. So I guess in a nutshell, one way to map these things out is, if you're neurotic, things in the middle are complex, as Jung would say. Okay, they're conflicted, ambivalent, confusing, perplexing, and there's emotional reactivity associated with all of that. Okay, there's a lot of people today in the 21st century in the Western world that are becoming emotionally reactive to an inappropriate degree. And it takes various different forms of expression to where these people get together. They tend to get caught up in conflict, almost instantly and inappropriately, conflictive, emotionally reactive. Wilhelm Reich would describe it as reaction in general, right? In terms of, what feeds political reaction, whether it's right wing or left wing. Denial, both sides of the fence accusing the others by projecting upon the others defense mechanism wise. It's like a feedback system that just feeds itself into a state of conflict, right? And then related chaos and confusion. Okay. And people are getting that way now in the Western world where they weren't that way about 50 years ago, much. All of what went on in the 60s was induced, in my view, by cultic means through intelligence networking, right? People had to be brought into that state, and then they had to be brought back out of it again so they could rest for a few decades and forget, and then be brought back into it again. They kind of did that in the 90s, and it didn't really kick over much, and then they stopped doing it. Then after 2010, you get into 2011, you got the Occupy movement where they're gathering people up in kind of a homeless situation where emotional reactivity is an inevitability. Anesthetization, muscular armoring, anesthesia associated with that are promoted, especially if you happen to already be neurotic, right? Which most people kind of are, especially now, it seems. You can make people emotionally reactive. Therefore, you can make them politically reactive by feeding them propaganda or producing events in the media that incite and agitate, right? And then you got emotional reaction rolling, right? And it becomes political reaction. And people are at each other's throats because then the opposition wants to rise up in response, or maybe not enough. They'd rather prostrate themselves masochistically and cry while they're being beaten over the head by some political reactive, right? That's been activated by means that he does not understand. Okay, and he's even a proxy for crying out loud. For example, Antifa, proxied forward to basically just agitate, be agitated, incite, be incited, and be caught up in conflict with, BLM is kind of in the background laughing at the whole situation that they exploit because they're supposed to mirror British royalty, right? That you're supposed to eventually prostrate yourself before on your knee or whatever, according to events that unfolded, signal-wise in relation to events taking place in 2020, the summer of, right? So I think I've finished up with Cancer for now. I might have to, when the ideas start rolling along again, produce another part. And then I can get into Capricorn in the next episode, it looks like. So I'll leave you there. Thank you for listening to all of this.